Welcome. So I'm Paul Whitkay, founder and CEO of the Alliance of Chief Executives. I'm excited to welcome you all to our roundtable today. We're going to be talking about the value of advisory boards. And over the last 27 years, I've had the privilege to work with CEOs of all types in virtually every industry. And I've noticed over the last few years that more and more CEOs have put together advisory boards of many different types for different reasons to assist them in virtually all aspects of their businesses, whether it's running the businesses, looking into the future, the phases of business, so from startup all the way to global public companies and their exits. And it was just a few months ago, I happened to meet Louise Brockman. She's in Brisbane, Australia, and she was more passionate about anybody I've ever met about the power of advisory boards. And so as I got to know Louise, I said, and Louise has done more work on studying the trends and status and power and reasons of advisory boards. So we basically said, this is something that could be applied and be valuable to almost every CEO out there. And so it's a good excuse to bring our Alliance members and friends from around the world. And frankly, we've got folks zooming in here from everything from Georgia and Atlanta and the East Coast to Silicon Valley to Hawaii to Australia. And I probably missed a few, but welcome everybody. I've always believed in bringing people a whole lot smarter than me together and creating an environment where we can talk and engage and learn from each other. So today we're going to be talking about advisory boards. And I put together a small panel just of experience to get a better understanding of what we're actually talking about. And we've got a fantastic panel, and it's diverse. It's just four of them. They've run companies, everything ranging from boilers and pumps, hardcore industrial type businesses, to medical equipment and devices, and to HR services and super high tech. And so let's get rolling. Quick introduction so we know who our panelists are. Lena, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation, Paul. I am a big fan of advisory boards as well, so eager to share and learn from everybody else here. My name is Lena Wu, and I've been in the life science industry for almost 30 years, focusing corporate development, business development. I've spent a good deal of time being consulting for early stage companies, so have done diagnostics, therapeutics, as well as tools. And then most recently, I've been founder and CEO first of a therapeutics company, cured psoriasis in mice, didn't work so well in humans. And then my second company was Intavia. We built an analytical instrument for drug development. That company was acquired by Ciex in late 2020. And since that time, I've been doing more advisory work and board work.
So, well, thank you and welcome. Jim.
Glad to be here with the rest of the group. I'm sure we can all learn from each other and share our experiences with advisory boards. The company I'm in is a family-owned company started back in the mid-50s, and never too late to learn. We've had the advisory board in place for 5 years now. Have seen great value. We've brought in, distinct, individuals with distinct backgrounds so that we can cover a broad range of the things we do. As Paul mentioned, I'm the boiler and pump guy. So it may not sound like the most exciting business, but I can guarantee about any facility, building, or all kinds of different places, we're in the background somewhere. Some of our biggest customers are in healthcare, biotech, food. So if our equipment is not working, things aren't good. So that has over the years brought us significant opportunities to engage in the service part of our business. Geographically, so we're located throughout California and Nevada, have a total of 11 locations with folks on the road every day, taking care of the kind of equipment I've just described.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Renee from the Big Island.
Yes, aloha. Thank you, Paul. My name is Renee Lottie, 20+ year global tech executive, probably with a little more eye to Asia Pacific region, given my long tenure with Hitachi Limited. But since 2020, I am really a certified executive chair with the advisory board as Paul indicated, I found them during the COVID world and really found the framework and the discipline and the philosophy very refreshing for what I would have used if I'd known they existed. My experience and curiosities really from myself as a board member tend to follow in the areas of data economics, data literacy, digital transformation. And if I had something printed on my t-shirt, it would say, I am a citizen of data science, passionately trying to inspire others to join the citizenship. Thanks again for the invitation.
Wow, cool. All right, Louise, you got me into this. So just a brief introduction, and then go ahead and just tell them what made you so passionate about the advisory boards in the first place.
Thank you, Paul. And it's just really lovely to be able to be here and have this conversation today. And it's a global conversation. So thank you for doing this. So my role is I'm the founder of the Advisory Board Centre. So we're the professional body for the advisory board sector. So it's all about raising the standard of advisory boards, of the advisory board professionals. And then I guess raising the standard of individuals and the work that they do so it becomes more impactful in the organisations that they serve. We're the only professional body in the world really looking after the professionalisation of the advisory board sector. And we operate in over 25 countries today. So we're 6 years young. We have a 100-year strategy. So we've got 94 years to go in the ongoing development of this sector. So it's early days. I'm not sure if I'll make that 100th birthday, Paul, but I'm going to give it a crack.
I'm more interested in what year 101 would be like.
Yeah.
You're only planning for 100. So anyway, go ahead. Go ahead. What led you to found the Advisory Board Center?
Thank you, Paul. Look, I've had many businesses over the years, and my previous business in 2004, I was going through a stage of growth, and we'd actually developed a software package that was around really creating an evolution in the way that people were managed in the business sector. And we launched that package, and we ended up with thousands of businesses using that software, but not in the beginning. So we launched that software, and it was slower than I'd anticipated. And being a sole founder, that was really difficult because I ended up having to sell everything that I owned to keep that business going. And that was a really tough lesson to learn and to live through. And so a year later, we had an incredible opportunity to really grow that business globally. And I wanted to make sure that it was a business I was really proud of. We did it really well, and I wasn't second guessing the decisions that I was making. And, you know, Paul, with the work that you do, you make a decision as a business owner and you go, is that a good decision? I don't know, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I thought with the business that we had, that just wasn't good enough. And so I thought I need good people around me, people that I deeply admired, that I respected, and people that I wanted to be held accountable to, not lose control of the business that I worked so hard to build, but really hold myself to account. So I built an advisory board. I really didn't know what one was, but I did it anyway, and it was absolutely life-changing for me. After 5 years, we had built that business to 135 offices in 8 countries in that 5-year period. And I sold that business. I wanted to manage an exit for myself. And when I sold that business, I was very, very grateful for what the advisory board had not only done for the business, was not just a business impact, it also had that personal impact on me as a founder. And I just felt so grateful for it that after a bit of a break, I thought, if that can do that for me, what can it do for other people? And I decided to focus on research and development. And I didn't know how long it would take, but I would say, let's go and research this market, what's going on globally with advisory boards, because I came from an intellectual property and R&D background. And it took 5 years to research what's going on in the advisory board sector. What does good look like? What are the trends globally? What are the trends for consulting firms versus advisory? Where with ethical boundaries to advice? And that's when I found there was no professional body looking after the sector at all. And that's when we decided to build the advisory board centre as a professional body to stop being a player and actually bring this sector together by creating a foundation of support. Because the advisory board sector has been around since the beginning of time, but no professional body actually bringing it together was just an eye-opener to see that it wasn't. And so that's what I've been doing and dedicating my life to ever since.
All right, well, thank you. So a couple more CO perspectives. Jim, tell us a little bit. I remember when you came to me and talked about forming a advisory board a few years ago. Why did you want to do that? And tell us your journey.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Louise, thanks for, helping bring us all together with, the vision you have for this whole group. I'm sure I could learn something from the kind of material you've put together. So, yeah, when you've been around a long time and you have employees that have been with your company 20, 25, even 30 years, you lose some of the formality when you get together as a group. And we love how we interact. We are a great group, but again, there's times to have formality, as I say, to it. And as Louise said, holding yourselves accountable with an outside group. You just show up, I think, better prepared. You make the topics more meaningful and significant to, helping correct issues maybe that may come up, and just looking further out. We've been very fortunate to have 3 terrific external board members on our board. They've been there from our beginning of it, which we did starting in 2018, so 5 years. I think through COVID, it also helped. So about half the time we've had this, we've been, largely remote. We're back in person, just had our board meeting last week. And we just have terrific people helping us with that, coming in with different perspectives. Just one example, we've realigned our company organizationally. We've grown over time, been in business over 60 years, and you just kind of grow and see where you end up. But we had a structure of general managers geographically dispersed, and we just found that no one person really can represent all of what we do. It's not like they were just out there on their own, but everybody sort of gravitates to their own level of expertise and comfort. But by having a more vertically aligned company coming in with the right resource at the right time, just really has moved our company along in a much better way. And just kind of along the side of that, created a lot of advancement opportunities for folks in our company, because every position that it opened up by going through this process, all of those positions were filled internally. So again, having an outside set of eyes on that, what worked, what didn't, what would you do if you were in our situation, has been a great help to us. It's all been good.
All right, well, thank you. Lena, what's your story?
I'm going to speak from the perspective not only of a CEO, but CEO of a startup company. So small team, limited, set of expertise and bandwidth and just experience. And I would say, to me, I would encourage everyone to think about 2 kinds of advisory boards. So one is, you're developing a technology, developing a product. I early on put together an advisory board that was my technical team, but my goal was really, I want to find people who have done what I want to do, develop a product, develop an instrument. We had a particular technical area, get somebody in that. And the goal was, look, I want somebody who's done this many, many times. And ideally a stage or 2, been through my stage and a stage or 2 ahead of me, because it's my belief that I don't know how many of you play tennis. I play a lot of tennis now. It's all about reducing your unforced errors, right? Because if you're a startup, you only have so much time, you only have so much money. And there are mistakes that we can avoid. There's going to be mistakes we can't avoid, but let's avoid the mistakes we can. And to me, the way to avoid them was to have an advisory board, people who could, say, I had the same exact decision, should I do it in-house or should I contract out? Well, I decided to do this because that, right? So, like you don't know because you've never been there before, but if you have an advisory board, they've been there before and they give you advice. Then there's a source of hires, there's a source of networking. If you're going to go contract something out of house, which is pretty common for startups, they will know who's good, who's bad, and even who's the A team in a given CRO. So I think that's all really, really helpful. The other kind of advisory board I would also really encourage, especially early stage companies, to think about is a market advisory group, somebody who represents the customer. And for several reasons. One, you're going to need constant feedback of somebody who understands your technology really well and what you're trying to do, believes in what you're doing and is a big fan, and can really be honest with you about the little things, because you're going to need to understand details about adoption, about reducing friction. Everybody always thinks about, well, I want to build my product so it's going to have all these benefits. But you also need to think about how do you reduce the friction in the adoption? And oftentimes those don't come with, you need somebody who really understands what you're doing. And so I think that comes through advisory board. And then finally, those people, those sort of customer representatives, market representatives, they are the people who can validate you for when you're trying to raise a financing. Because investors are going to want to talk to somebody besides you and say, we want to talk to somebody who is a big fan and can tell us why they would buy this. So I had both of those experiences. I had, pharma advisory board and I had technical advisory board, and they were both super, super useful. And then I would just offer one little piece of advice, which is if you're a startup company, your needs will change pretty dynamically. Every advisor should have a 1-year term. You can always add on another year, but that 1-year term makes it easy to swap people out when the time comes, makes it less awkward.
All right. Well, thank you. And I've always believed in surrounding myself with people a lot smarter than me.
Exactly.
I'm not sure I've ever had a truly creative idea in my life. And I love analogies. And if I'm not mistaken, I saw Louise writing something down when you mentioned the unforced errors analogy in tennis. So thank you for giving a new thought there. So Renee, let's go to you. And you're you've advised many companies. What story? Give us a little bit of story from the advisor's perspective of how did you
have 8 or 9 of stories, but based on what I'm hearing, I picked one that might be just a little more. You might actually hear some Hawaiian music playing in the background as I tell the story, but the themes are very much in line with what you've heard from Louise and Lena. So the advisory board was built for historic community theater and art gallery, known for Polynesian cultural advancement. And they were looking for new revenue streams. And the reason for that was that since 1970, when this lovely entity was built, they used snail mail and still do, or did, and they used their foot traffic is the only ways to raise the revenue, whether you're buying a ticket for the theater event or you're buying art or you're learning about it. It's coming through your physical post office, or you're walking up to this cute little vintage window that has an arch cut in it that you pay your money through. And the governance board had been there since the beginning as well. So very, very well-established governance board operating since 1980. But you could tell they also had a lot on their plate, but had poked multiple times on what's next. What is next? And ultimately, it took a seat change in one of the governance board members. He was from tech, Silicon Valley, fellow, former executive, retiring here with his family and wanting to get involved in the community. And he started to ask those same questions that clearly have been asked multiple times. And so we formed a committee, and I became part of that advisory board committee. The term was a year, October of 2019 to October of 2020, when we put it together. I would say, if you were to say, where was this entity in its business growth? It was in the changing world. What's possible? What potentially is how we can diversify? Potentially, how do we leverage tech and digital better? So that became kind of the thing that was roaming around. While 100% of the revenue to date, approximately about 10 million a year, was walking in on their sneakers, their flip-flops, or coming in through the mail as a check. That was it. So a lot to look at. And so we said, let's create a structure, leveraging a little bit of what you'll hear from Louise here in a bit on the framework side. It was a 4-member advisory board. So we had a chair, which was external. We had 2 of us, who were external experts. So I was the digital data economics person. We also had a theater, arts, and TV from the mainland person. And then we had an internal advisory board manager, which is a kind of a new role, who was kind of our handler back to the governance board. Since it's a many-to-many relationship, you kind of needed to funnel it through something. And so this other person made up our 4-member board. And we met at first every 2 weeks, and ultimately got permission to play and did it monthly, half days. And the type of advisory board I describe this as is a think tank. And it was a think tank for 3 or 4 reasons. And the work was pretty diverse, but we had a year to figure it out. So we kind of knew how to chunk it up a bit. So some of the topics were, how do we digitize live performances? Some of our competitors on the mainland are. So one of our experts was from Chicago in the theater arts community. So he brought that idea. And how do you create subscriptions? How do you bill for such a thing? How about digitizing art galleries, like for education purposes? It's Polynesian and Hawaiian culture. We have all kinds of communities around the world who would love to learn about this. How do you turn it into educational programs? You don't physically have to be here in Hawaii to learn about it. And then also, how do we learn more about what currently was on spreadsheets and yellow sticky notes about our prospects and our customers? Like, we know we send mailers on these little labels every month about what's coming, and we get checks back in, but would they give us more or less if we'd done it differently? So those were the curiosities. And so the work that we undertook as our 3 experts were really some data value engineering work around advice to know your audience, was about granularity, not volumes of data. Good news, because they didn't have volumes of it, so it worked. We also explored and educated and showed them opportunities around what might a subscription model look like. So there was discussions. And remember, these discussions were with the governance board. Through our advisory board cat herder of us, we would present and we'd have a conversation. They were the decision makers, but they knew that they needed that exploration, or as you put it, Lena, the expertise. So the other things we talked about also is we could tell a little bit, we needed to satisfy the governance board's confidence in the leaders in both the gallery area as well as in the theater area. Could these entities, could these leaders and their teams actually execute on some of these ideas that we were bringing forward and discussing and think tanking about? And so you also wanted to be sure that you were helping coach those leadership to be in front of the board as well, the governance board as well. Ultimately, punchline of the story, if you remember what I said about the timeline, it was October 2019 to October 2020. Well, some little thing called COVID hit right in the middle of that. So as we were doing this work, really kind of heard about it. It was a buzz back in October. It was in full force as we were about halfway through our tenure. We actually had to the governance board and the leadership had to shut this 500-person theater down. Full stop, no more gallery. And so it kind of created a little bit of a panic, but less of a panic if they hadn't had started some of this work already. But we kind of doubled down on a lot of the work after, James, to your point about the help and the workers. We actually had to help them walk through, how do you let some of these individuals go? Or were they willing to be furloughed, or were they willing to do it voluntarily because it's such a well-loved entity in the community? And then we got back to business. And so we went from 100% of revenue by foot traffic to 0% by foot traffic because there wasn't any revenue. And then we had to work extremely hard to get that confidence into those teams to say, look, we can just accelerate some of this, but we have to keep going. And oh, by the way, let's do it all virtually. So we got to walk in the shoes of what did it mean to have digital everything. And ultimately, fast forward until the end of this last year, so 2022, when we were able to actually have 500 butts in seats, live audience, as well as a theater TV and a theater audience, we actually pivoted to about 18% revenue came in through the education, the gallery, digital gallery, and the theater TV for this entity. And I think, celebrated a big success. It took a little longer than that full year to see and measure that KPI, but I think is a really good story about how we brought all those right people together that knew what they knew to then do the what if and what's possible to a governance board.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Lena, what about your perspective from when you're on the other side of the table as an advisor or on the advisory board to the companies?
I have to say that one of the advisor groups I'm really having a great time is where I am essentially the industry expert. So the company is a software company. They had technology that, had been previously directed towards a different market, and they wanted to bring their software tools to the pharmaceutical manufacturing market. And so I came in as sort of their market expert and helping them understand how pharma thinks, how pharma does business, what are their needs. And I think it works really well if you come in as bringing that expertise and really able to complement the existing team. I would also say that there's a question about cases when, how do you make sure it's a good fit, right? And both from the CEO perspective, having an advisory board and then being an advisor and joining a company, I think it is great for both sides, whether you're the company or the advisor, to have a trial run, have a trial period, right? So try it out as a consultant first, so not quite the level as formal as an advisor, and join a meeting, where you're part of a group and you're interacting, meet the rest of the company, make sure you like everybody, that you can get along, that it's productive, that you have the sort of same cultural values. I think it's just, and if that works, great, then you can do an advisor agreement. If it doesn't work out, no harm done, right? You probably all learned a little something, but you could kind of tell the chemistry wouldn't work for a longer term. I think that helps both sides.
All right. Well, thank you. Louise, I think you've are in the process or just recently put together your latest state of the market report on advisory boards. So if you could share a little bit of that, just give them some more or less research perspectives of advisory boards, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I might just share my screen just so I can share some of the highlights of that report. So a bit of background to the State of the Market report is it's a market report that we produce every 2 years on what's happening in the global market for the advisory board sector. So the first one was produced in 2019, then 2021, and then and this one's due for release on the 2nd of June. So very, very close to it. So this is a bit of a sneak preview, if you like, of some of the key results from it. So when we look at where advisors are engaged in the model, in the market, we need to really put it into context of where does it fit into the landscape of the other different options that we have of where we seek advice from. So it goes from informal through to formal. So informally, we get advice from family and friends since the day we were born. Whether we want it or not, we're going to get their advice. That's the most informal level. And then we get peers in business. And as business owners and founders in this group today, it's so important to have these networks of other peers in business where we socialize, we meet up for a coffee, we talk things through. And business network groups are also like that as well, where you might have a network of owners coming together. Everyone talks about, it's lonely in business. These business networks are so important in the socialization of advice and providing that mutual support. Very important. Then you get the one-to-one engagement where you have an expert advisor that has some really clear boundaries around where they provide advice and where they don't. So the accountant, the mentor, the consultant, the expert, there's generally a really defined beginning, middle, and end to that advice that's really very specific. Where that gets challenging in the area of one advisor to one organisation is that the ethical boundaries sometimes get blurred, not for any ill intent, but because there's so much trust that's been built in that one-to-one engagement. And so, say, for instance, I may be a business owner. Paul, I bring you on as my expert advisor around accounting and finance, right? And so you are an absolute gun in those markets. I might then have an issue in another area, which might be, say, marketing. And I say, Paul, I know it's not your area of expertise, but I really want to run this by you because I trust you. I should question myself, should I actually be asking you that? And then you, because you really, you enjoy working with me, that built that trust, you know the business, you'll go there just because you want to help. And ethically, there's the question about, should we be providing advice in that space or not? So it's an ethical challenge on both sides of that table. Advisory boards then fill a different need where it's not a one-to-one engagement. There's an independent chair, there's external advisors, and there's a charter, and you measure impact on an annual basis to then do that review process, as Lena mentioned, about when you need to potentially move your advisors on and change them out. So that's an advisory board. And then a governance board is when you have a board of directors. It's a decision-making model. It's a serious undertaking, and rightly so. You can go to jail for the decisions that are made or not made, but also it's binding on the organisation to implement on those decisions. Now, the market generally doesn't know the difference between a governance board and an advisory board. So if we look at the most simple definitions of governance boards, they make decisions. It's binding. An advisory board do not make decisions. They're a problem-solving model, not a decision-making model. And that's really the difference in, I guess, their function, which means the conversation is different and the outcomes are different, but also the level of control. For a lot of business owners, like many on this call today, if you don't want to lose control of the decisions that you're making and control of the asset that you've worked so hard for, increasing the governance board potentially is not the right thing to do, and building an advisory board into your framework just makes good business sense. Now, advisory boards do come in lots of different flavours. And so again, from informal to formal, you get informal advisory boards where a business owner may chair their own advisory board, won't pay their people. It's kind of ad hoc. Then you've got on-demand advisor panels where you pre-select a panel and just use them as you need them. Then peer advisory boards where you have one chair and you've got many businesses around a table is a really interesting socialisation of that advice. When businesses are saying, I want an advisory board, I don't think I'm quite ready yet, they'll generally start with an advisory board of one and then build into it over time and bring the advisors on over time. And generally the way that they would start that is having a pop-up advisory board where you've got an independent chair and then you bring advisors in as you need them. Now, the big change in the market right now is very exciting, and this is project advisory boards. Lena, you made a mention of this around market advisory boards and customer advisory boards. They are absolutely on trend at the moment of not having an advisory board to focus on everything, which is about the strategy. Project advisory boards are about focusing on a strategy. And 53% of advisory boards today are project advisory boards when they're starting new. So it could be around entering a new market, solving a problem around supply chain, sustainability, customer advisory boards, next generation advisory boards. It's a very exciting space and it's very commercially smart. And best practice advisory boards then is when you've got an independent chair, you have a charter, you have external advisors and you measure impact. If we look at where the business sector is, and so when we research the advisory boards, we call the business sector those businesses that have $1.5 to $100 million turnover businesses. That's the heartland of advisory boards where they are known to add impact and the most utilised in the market. The average size of a business when they start using advisory board is between $1 to $1.5 million in revenue turnover, but the average size of a business with an advisory board in the business sector is 20 million, and the investment in an advisory board is generally between $40,000 to $70,000 for the first year of an advisory board based on current rates. And the structure is mostly businesses look for an independent chair who has a high level of commercial acumen, and the advisors are then chosen fit for purpose for what that business is trying to achieve over the next 12 to 18 months. And then evaluating that on an annual basis helps you to then rotate those advisory board members. But it's interesting when you think about trying to rotate advisory board members without them losing face, saying we don't need you anymore. Every advisor has a use by date, but when you're recruiting an advisory board member, it's also you are offboarding them as much as you are onboarding them. So saying and managing their expectations up front really helps to make sure that people are not offended when it's time to change because the business needs have changed. Having 4 to 6 meetings a year is common for an advisory board, but a chair will generally work with the business on a monthly basis because the relationship of a chair is very different to that with the relationship of the advisors. But I just mentioned that project advisory boards is the big thing at the moment. It's really smart. It's great return on investment, and it's a great way to really get sharp thinking done. So an advisory board could be a 90-day advisory board through to an ongoing advisory board. And that's the absolute, I know Mike Richardson's on this call today, but that's the absolute agility that advisory boards offer the market, that governance boards just don't have that flexibility that advisory boards do. The two key trends that are driving the advisory board activity in the market, because the advisory board sector has actually grown 20% worldwide since 2021. And so that's pretty significant. And one of them is something that Renee had mentioned, which is around advisory boards having this very important role that is new in the way that it supports governance boards in a governance system. So the language is really changing about advisory boards and governance boards working collaboratively, but still independently in a system of governance. And part of that is because directors, all of us as directors, really, we're all struggling with the constraint that we have as directors. There's a lot of personal liability that sits with being a director. You need to know a lot. And there's a lot going on. So the agendas are getting bigger. Paul, I spoke with somebody last week. We had our summit where advisors came in from around the world. There was one there that is a governance board director as well. Their board packs are 800 pages every month, right? And so you just think the agendas are getting bigger, that there's less people doing it. So how do you cover all of that in a way that you're going to be confident in the decisions that you make? This is a new landscape for advisory board, the advisory board sector, and it's a very important one too. The stakeholder economy is important as well, but the active advisors around the world, the US market, and I'm so glad that there are so many owners and entrepreneurs here today, but the majority of advisory boards in the world is in the US market. So it makes up 54% of the market in the US market. The UK European zone is quite large as well, but not quite as much as the US market. And so there's really good activity worldwide for advisory boards in market itself. The advisory board professional landscape is also changing. So you get firms that are offering advisory board services, you get individual professionals that add into their portfolio of the work they do, or entrepreneurs or business owners wanting to share their expertise, still operating their own business, but then sitting on advisory boards outside of their business to really support and make a difference to others. And then you get those internal executives now in large organisations that are managing advisory boards internally, but also then managing their own personal transition. But the change in the government, in the market for large organisations, corporate entities like Salesforce, like Amazon, like government departments building advisory boards and having professionals managing advisory boards is such an interesting market change. And what I love about that, and be good to get your views on this, advisory boards came from the heartland of the business sector, and now large organisations and corporates and government are using advisory boards because of the work that's been done in the business sector. And I just love that the business sector has actually led the way in the development of the advisory board sector. So as this sector grows, ethics and best practice really matters, because self-regulation has to happen when there's not largely it's not regulated or legislated, but it's starting to become regulated. And so self-regulation and evaluation of what good looks like is important. So we've developed a independent best practice and ethics advisory board that oversee the ongoing development of best practice for the advisory board sector globally. It's principles based. Jane Beaumont is on the call today. She's a member of this independent best practice and ethics advisory board. So it's around having clarity of scope, structure and discipline and measurement, which is all around the process. And then the ethics of having independent advisors that are independent of the organisation as well as for each other. So you don't create these conflicts of interest that could happen, but also making sure the advisors are really fit for purpose for what that organisation needs. You don't want advisors that are not going to be adding value to the agenda of itself. So the best practice framework is freely available and really important for the advisory board sector to really raise the standard of advisory boards. So that's just a bit of an overview, Paul. There's a bit more to the 46-page report, but they're the key things that I guess are important today.
All right. Well, thank you. And let's get to our questions. I got a lot of questions, not enough time, but Michelle Chen asked, and this is for the panel, anybody, and since we got a lot of questions, it's just whoever wants to answer it to do so. But she would like to know, what lessons have you learned from things that didn't work out? Whether it's the wrong advisor or the board itself wasn't functioning, or it's too much time, too little value. What lessons might you guys have learned? Renee, or Lena, Jim? Well, Jim, you've had one board and it's been working out. So any examples of what didn't work or what not to do?
Yeah, I don't, fortunately, it's worked so well. We haven't had to change anybody out. And I would just say it, we've heard comments about, turning a board over every year, and I'm sure that can work. I think in our case, because our board meets quarterly, I'd say it took about a year for them to know enough about our company to help us out. There's a ramp time. I wouldn't expect too much too fast.
Any other, Louise, you've seen more than others. Just what's if a board advisors is not working out, or a significant board, what's the number one reason?
If everyone has a use by date, Paul, the reason to change out advisors may not necessarily because the advisor's not good, is that the needs of the business have changed.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing. Measuring the impact of an advisory board on an annual basis is good. I agree with you, Jim, that it takes time for the advisory board to work. All of business advisory boards operate between 18 months to 3 years. That's the most common. And having a 3-year advisory board, you do get so much value because they get to know the business really well. You don't need to explain yourself as a business owner to your advisory board. So I think that is a really important point that Jim has made. Where advisory boards fail, 10% of advisory boards fail, and we've researched this deeply. And when they fail, it's because the business has recruited the advisory board for the wrong reasons. And when a business is going through a cash flow crisis, isn't it? That's the biggest example of when advisory boards fail. So when a business is going through a cash flow crisis and they're trying to put advisory board together to solve that problem, it's the wrong construct for that issue. And so where I guess I'm probably the most biased person around advisory boards, it's not the answer to everything. So it's got to be really carefully scoped out about what you want your advisory board to focus on and what you don't want that advisory board to focus on, because you may have some no-go zones in the business where you don't want your advisory board to talk about because you've got it covered. And so by being really clear about the charter, what they're there to do and what they're not there to do. If you're not clear about that, the advisory board just becomes this big conversation, but it's actually not going anywhere. So having a really clear purpose for that advisory board is where you really maximize that impact.
Yeah, Louise, maybe I'll add to that just quickly, is having the charter, but then having a strong chair who knows his or her purpose to ensure that we keep comparing ourselves when we get together to that is also when that person is not strong in that role, that's another reason an advisory board fails, because they're not doing the job they've been hired to do to make sure that it's fit for purpose.
Yeah, and I would also add, I think you can't expect an advisory board to be this magic wand, right? You have to go in with, you have to be rigorous about selecting the right people, and you have to be willing to put in the work, as Jim said, to help the advisory board not only understand your company and your strategy, but if you're developing a product, what it is that you're building, you have to help them understand that. If you want good advice, you have to be willing to put in the work to prepare the meeting, to identify, define the questions, and give them the background so that they can be useful. So it isn't just a matter of finding the right person and hiring them or a group of people. You have to be willing to put in the group to get something out of it. I would also say that just, keep in mind, if you're a dynamic startup where literally your business could change from 6 months to the next year, that's another reason why, your boards, they're good, but the business has changed. So to be able to keep that in mind, I think is important.
Yeah, Lena, and it's intimidating sometimes to be prepared to know to invite the advisory boards that they're most productive. So a little bit of a light plug for a loosely federated framework. That's why I like the advisory board center's work when I kind of got curious about it back in 2020, is if I were that CEO and I wasn't sure the questions to ask or what should I know before I bring somebody to the party, there's some good helpers that an advisory board informal chair, if you find that person, would then come and say, well, let's walk through a few of these questions about strategy, about this, about that. And if you can't answer those questions as the owner or the founder or the CEO, you'll start to understand, oh, wait, I need to go do some more homework before I really go do this other thing. And so that advisory board framework for the entity that wants to hire an advisory board actually is out there as well. So it's a little intimidating sometimes if you're doing your very first one as a founder or CEO.
Yep.
Okay, let's keep moving.
Hey, Paul, I'll just add one comment here. One thing we found very useful is we get together as a group the night before for dinner. Just kind of the social, you get a little more one-on-one going on during that period of time. And, the group then is, again, better connected to not just with the company, but with each other. So I would just add maybe that social setting could be an important component.
And that could work remotely.
Can I ask a very quick question? If you want to change the composition of the existing advisory board because business has moved on, you have change in the vision, or how did you? I mean, it's really hard. Like nobody wants to tell the ones, oh, you've been, advised us for the last, 3 or 5 years. We don't want you anymore. We want somebody else. My experience for some other companies, like the board can be so big, nobody's managing them, and nobody wants to be the bad person saying no. So I was wondering what you guys have been advised to just say, hey, ask very nicely without burning the bridge. Hey, we're time to move on. We had to ask you to step back, and because we had to make room for the new ones or whatever.
I mean, somebody has to be a grown-up in the room, right? And have the hard conversation, basically. So
I will add one observation from working with CEOs for so long. The ones that do not, the expectations are very important, because the complaints I've heard from operating CEOs that aren't used to being advisors or board directors, they're used to having people listening to their advice. And so frankly, if the communication with board advisors who are experienced CEOs, having them be aware that the CEO still has decision making, and they can get frustrated. The advisor can get frustrated when they don't get listened to enough, and then start to depart. So the expectations and communications are really critical. Let's move on. Let's see here. Drew Kyle in Australia just asked, for those of you who have experience between formal boards and advisory boards, how do you think about them, and how do you make certain they're not in conflict, but they're complementary? Lena, I think you had
yeah, So I tend to think of the board of directors has governance responsibilities, right? And whereas you can have an advisory board that is very topic specific, like as we just discussed earlier, around your technology development, around your product development, around, sort of a specific market. So those are really different missions, essentially, for each of those groups. I also, at least my personal experience is, I have used advisory boards to help augment or supplement or fill in a gap of expertise from my own team, because in a startup, your team is oftentimes very small. They can help you with specific decisions, and they oftentimes have operating and real experience doing what you've done. That's not always the case for a private company board, especially if you have a lot of investor board members, right? So sometimes they don't have, they're really good at sort of thinking about the board and its financial outcome, or sorry, the company and its financial future, but they may not actually have operating experience. So that's where I see them complement each other, and where the board has fiduciary responsibility for the company. That's a different focus.
Okay. And we're going to go into our breakout rooms in a few minutes where we actually get to talk. Everybody gets to talk and engage. But there is a good number of questions prior to the meeting. But for potential advisors, leaders and CEOs, how do you, if you're interested in serving on somebody else's advisory board, how do you how do you make that happen? And then what kind of compensation is there typically? I'm sure there's a wide range of from everything from volunteer to highly compensated or lots of equity, but just some thoughts on how that might be designed, and how do you actually get on a board that you'd enjoy but also be productive and valuable?
Louise, you just did a market research on the compensation that just literally is part of your study. So maybe give that as a starting point.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. We do a research on this every year and produce a market report for advisory board professionals. The rates do vary. So the business sector advisory board professionals generally charge between $2,000 to $3,500 for a half a day. Now, the US market's probably a little bit broader than that. In the business sector, it ranges between $1,000 and $5,000 for the business market. And for the corporate market, advisory board roles are either double that or nothing. So it's a bit like a gambling. So I get double or nothing. But the balance between what's paid and what's pro bono, that is changing in the market. There's more and more expectation for advisory board members to be paid. And when we survey it, we see advisory board professionals, 75% of their portfolio is paid, 25% is pro bono by choice. And it may be advisory boards, it may be mentoring, it may be other things that they do as a pro bono thing. I think this market is going to change and mature over time. What's important is if you're charging professional fees, that you should also have your professional indemnity insurance, because the risk profiles of advisory boards are changing as well. So if you're providing the more specialized advice you're providing, the greater the risk that's associated with that. But the market is definitely maturing in this space. How to get gigs? If you're wanting to work with the business sector, the business owners like us here on this call, you don't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh my goodness, I need an advisory board." It's a function. We wake up at 2:00 in the morning saying, "My staff are driving me crazy. I've got issues with my supply chain. I've got, all these things that keep you awake." And so it's about being able to have a conversation about what is it what that business needs, and being able to have an intelligent conversation about it. And one of the options that they have is an advisory board. It's not the answer to everything, but you've got to be able to have those conversations. People don't go out there and just advertise a lot for advisory boards. These relationships really count. And if you've got deep curiosity and you want to have conversations with people about the things that matter to them, that creates opportunity for advisory boards more than anything else. That's been my experience.
Okay. thank you all for joining me. I learned from every single one of you, so thank you. And thank you to our panelists, to Lena and Jim and Renee and Louise for joining us today and sharing your experience and wisdom. I appreciate it. And go out there and make a difference, guys. Thank you.